Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. In this video what I'd like to do is pick up where I left off on my previous video, Value Theory and Epicurus 1, and create a part 2 to that video. And in this video what I'm going to do is just conclude my discussion of Epicurus' value theory and then discuss how his value theory pertains to thinking about the badness of death of the person who dies. So we'll come to that last bit in a moment. Let's just pick up and start talking a bit more about his value theory. So we know that Epicurus is a philosophical hedonist. And what this means, of course, is that there's only one thing that's intrinsically good, namely pleasure, and there's only one thing that's intrinsically bad, namely pain. Easy enough. Now, being a value theorist, he's developed a theory of what he takes to be good, a theory of what he takes to be bad. Epicurus is still interested in the connection between the intrinsic good of pleasure and other goods that aren't intrinsically good. What should jump out at us here is the good known as virtue, morality sometimes, more generally, but Epicurus was very interested in the idea of virtue. And this is important because it seems as if, at least intuitively, that virtue has some kind of intrinsic worth. It seems like it's good in and of itself to, say, be just or to be courageous. Those being two examples of virtues that we have. Others being moderation, wisdom. So it stands to reason that someone who argues that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, let's just focus on intrinsic goodness for our purposes here, has to tell us how it is that pleasure relates to virtue. Especially since, as I've said, virtue seems to be the kind of thing that we would take to be intrinsically good. It certainly seems to be something that we value in and of itself. Maybe not all of us, but at least we regularly do. At least we see it as a potential candidate for being something that's intrinsically good. Now, of course, there may be no connection between valuing something as intrinsically good and it actually being intrinsically good. But let's set that issue aside for right now. And let's ask the question, what's Epicurus' view on the relationship between pleasure on the one hand and virtue on the other? Well, what he has to say, and what he does say, is that virtue is extrinsically good only. So if we're to understand the idea of intrinsic goodness as something being good in and of itself or by its very nature, then an extrinsic good is a good that isn't intrinsically good. It's not good by its very nature. It's good because of other things. It's, in some sense, derivatively good. It's good in relation to the intrinsic good. It's something that contributes to the intrinsic good, or leads to the intrinsic good. So Epicurus has to say that. So thinking about the virtues then, say courage or justice, Epicurus is going to have to say that those goods, traits of character, if you will, are good only insofar as they contribute to pleasure, enhancing one's pleasure in one's life. Now, according to Epicurus, there is a very significant virtue, one that he takes to be the most significant of all the virtues in its connection to living the pleasant life, or to leading a life where pleasure is properly enjoyed in order to live the best life possible. And this virtue is prudence. Prudence is a kind of wisdom about what's good for oneself. And so, according to Epicurus, what we need to do is have a kind of knowledge about the kinds of things that are good for us. And it's through this exercise of prudence, being able to calculate when we'd be securing the best amount of pleasure for ourselves and minimizing the the pain that we take in our lives, either in our soul and our bodies. That's what prudence is all about. And he wants to tell us that this is the most significant of all the virtues. And then the other virtues, say justice, courage, moderation, they all kind of are underneath in some sense. They are all subordinate. That's a better term there. To prudence. So one has good reasons to act justly because in doing so, one will put oneself in a position to live a pleasant life. It's not as if acting justly toward other people is something that has intrinsic worth in and of itself. It's only because when I act justly, to treat people fairly, just for example, it's a basic way of understanding justice is more complicated than that, but just understanding justice in terms of the idea of fairness, we could see that if I treat people fairly, justly, then I put myself in a position to not be harmed by them. So by acting unjustly, unfairly toward others, I could end up experiencing quite a bit of pain or the absence of pleasure, in which case I am not living the best life I could live. So this is the way Epicurus understands things. There's the intrinsic good, pleasure, as we know. And then there are a host of extrinsic goods. And let's just focus here on the virtues. Virtues are extrinsically good. They derive their value from the pleasure they bring about. And chief among the virtues is prudence. And prudence is going to allow us to figure out how it is that we can, through our experiences, through the exercising of our virtues, produce as much pleasure as we can to live the best life possible. Now, of course, Epicurus, he has a rather subdued notion of pleasure and what it amounts to. It means, at least in part, as we've seen, the idea that there's an absence of pain in the body, an absence of conflict in the soul. Maybe more complicated than that, but that at least gives us a sketch of what Epicurus has in mind by his idea of pleasure here. So here we see the connection between virtue on the one hand, pleasure on the other. And given that Epicurus wants to say that virtue isn't an intrinsic good, contrary to what you may intuitively think, he has given us at least a close connection between the two. Of course, they're not the same thing, can't be the same thing, but there's a close connection between them. And this leads Epicurus to say things like the virtuous life, or the pleasant life, is going to be the life that has virtue in it, because you're going to have the virtues in order to get to the intrinsic goods. The virtues are going to help you secure the pleasure that you need to experience the good life. Okay, so that's Epicurus' value theory. That's what I want to say about it in this video lecture. Much more that could be said, but let's move on and talk about Epicurus' famous argument on the issue of the badness of death for the person who dies. Now, just to be clear here, Epicurus doesn't think death is bad for the person who dies. Of course, he can say death is bad for other people. There are people who haven't died, who are still alive, etc. Okay? But he develops an argument for the claim that death is not bad for the person who dies. He also thinks we shouldn't fear it for roughly the same reasons. But I want to focus on his argument for the claim that death is not bad for the person who dies. Here's the basic idea. Nobody experiences death, so how can death be bad for the person who dies? So Epicurus is working here with a concept of death, according to which death is the permanent end of existence. Death is sort of a blank on consciousness. You're no longer conscious, you're no longer alive. So if you're not alive, if you no longer exist, more exactly, then you can't have any experiences. You can't have experiences, then you can't have either good or bad experiences. So death can't be bad for the person who dies, because death can't be experienced. That's the basic idea. So that may be a way of just laying out the argument here, just in clear premises rather than that intuitive formulation, would be to say, step one, something is bad for someone only if it's experienced. Step 2 would be death can't be experienced by the person who dies. Conclusion, therefore death is not bad for the person who dies. Death can't be bad for the person who dies. Again, there's no subject of experience. There's no existent being, there's no then experience to be had. And in order for anything to be good or bad for someone, the being would have to exist and experience something. So I think that's clear enough. So Epicurus wants to try to dispel the idea that death is bad for the person who dies. He does this because he thinks that people have so much fear regarding death that it actually compromises their quality of life. The goodness of their life is compromised. The pleasure in their lives is compromised. Conflict in the soul is what occurs, and the conflict in the soul is what compromises living a happy life. A happy life, of course, is a pleasant life for Epicurus. So we're not living a good life when we're constantly fearing death. And so Epicurus, he wants to try to help us, help free us from this fear of death that we have. And the way he's going to do so is just by letting us know that it can't be bad for us. We tend to fear things that are bad for us. Now, it's important to keep in mind here, in case you're curious, you might be thinking, well, I don't think death is the end of my existence. So when I die, my soul continues to exist, or I somehow exist physically in the afterlife. That might be true, and we need to get into that debate in order to deal with Epicurus. What we can ask is this question, if we like. Would death be bad for the person who died if death is defined in the way Epicurus defines it? So you may disagree with Epicurus on the details of what happens when one dies, say in this life. But still the question is, what would happen were you to die? Were you to no longer continue existing? Because if you think of that, death here is just a physical death, and then there's some kind of soulful life thereafter, then you haven't really died. Only part of you has died. And indeed, an inessential part of you, presumably. So we could ask the question, suppose it were the case that at some point I physically and or soulfully die, would death be bad for me in those circumstances? In that way, in some sense, we engage Epicurus more directly. We don't disagree with him about what happens when we die. Epicurus believes in the idea that we're purely physical things, and even our soul is a physical thing, and these physical composite things that we are, well, they decompose, and when they properly decompose, we die, including our souls, which are physical things. So the crucial thing here to take away is just that we can ask the question, is death bad for the person who dies, if we understand death as the permanent end of one's existence? And we can ask this question, right, even if we don't think that this life, when we die, is our end. Okay, so try to think about Epicurus in that light. Now, suppose one wanted to challenge Epicurus, rather than focusing on his view of death and the afterlife, his flat-out rejection of an afterlife. Well, perhaps what we can do is we could challenge the idea that that something's bad for someone only if it's experienced. Perhaps we can think of examples where something's bad for someone, even if that person hasn't experienced it. So a famous example in the history of philosophy is, suppose we imagine somebody who's like a perfect cheater, who cheats on his wife, for example, and does so perfectly without ever giving any sign or hint away that he's doing so. There's some reason for thinking that this is bad for this man's wife, even though she can't experience it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there and let you think about that question. And this concludes my part 2 video lecture on value theory and Epicurus. Thank you very much for watching, everybody.